Damsel by Elana K. Arnold. Quick note before I start reading this book. This book has a lot of themes in it that might be very upsetting for anyone who is especially sensitive to themes of violence against women or misogyny and sexual abuse. Anyway, so just a forewarning. The story is very, very intense in its metaphors, and it does not brush lightly over abuse. So I'd advise you listen with caution if you are easily triggered. It's still a very important book. And another important thing I wanted to say about this book is that this book came out long before Netflix decided to make a movie entitled Damsel. And their story is not the same story. And they created a movie tie-in book before the actual Netflix release of their movie. So it actually garnered more attention, but it is not the same story in any way. And it was really infuriating for me as someone who really loved this when I found out about, when I first saw the trailers for it, I was like all excited because I thought it was this. I thought it was based on this Damsel, which I had already read and already thought was so excellent, and I was like, that's really fantastic if it really is true, because it's just a really powerful story, and very anti-misogyny. And the problem with what I saw from the trailer is that this, it's obvious the story is different. And even though it's being painted as this is some feminist story where a girl goes to defeat an actual dragon and her entire, the entire kingdom is like not believing in her or sending her to her death or something. That is not the case with this original story, and the metaphors within this story, like when you've already read it, you would see why it's so upsetting for Netflix to have made this movie that overshadows something that would actually truly have done more good than some story where it's literally a girl going against an actual dragon. Like, that's not what this is. So I really hate that whole idea of like feminism that's blocking out actual feminism. So, but anyway, I just hate it that I feel like it was kind of like one of those things where like some media comes along that buries another existing media that had so much going for it. Let me start now. Okay. Damsel, Elana K. Arnold. One. The dragon's blame. The castle seemed to grow from the cliffs that cupped the shoreline. Its jagged peaked turrets pierced the rain-heavy clouds above. Its windows were gaping mouths and gored-out eyes. Between the slate-gray cliffs and the smoke-gray sky, and the churning gray sea, and the ghost-gray mist, it was a gray place indeed. It was so thoroughly gray that a traveler who lost his way could be blinded by it, by the overwhelming grayness that permeated everything, erasing vision entirely. Stay too long in this gray world, the legend went, and risk your eyes turning gray too. Risk your skin growing ashen. Risk your hair dulling to iron. Yes, it was a gray world. Sitting upon the broad back of this night-black steed, Prince Emery of Harding scanned the vast gray scene around him. There was the beach, the quiet waves lapping upon the shoreline like a kitten at the dish of cream, the tameness and gentle repetition belying the fierceness Emery knew the great sea had hidden within it. There beneath his horse's hooves was a short, pebbled beach, peppered with stones of all shades of gray, from nearly black to nearly white. Emery and his steed, whom he called Renard, had emerged onto his beach from a dense forest through which there was no trail. Emery had been obliged to lead his horse much of the way, slashing a path for them with his sword. As Emery had grown closer to the edge of the forest, the trees he encountered grew harder and harder, until finally he found that they were no longer made of wood at all, but rather petrified stone. These trees, even Emery's loyal, lethal sword, had been powerless against, a fact that ignited a flame of anger in his chest. When he struck at a tree should fall. That is what trees do. That is what they had always done, trees. It was their duty. But these last trees would not fall, and when Emery struck them with his sword, an awful clang rang out, and the impact of blow vibrated up through Emery's sword arm, and rattled all of his bones. Not even a dent. Unacceptable. Yet he had been forced to accept it. He had been forced to unsaddle Renard, so the horse was narrow enough to pick a path through the trees that refused to get out of their way, no matter, Emery had told himself, if he flung the saddle back onto Renard. As he fastened to the girth, the horse grunting, as he hefted himself into the saddle once again, he walked the horse along the beach, surveying as Renard picked a path through the pebbles. Emery would punish the forest on the dragon's flesh, for he knew that it was the dragon's blame that the trees turned to grey stone, just as it was the dragon's blame that this part of the world was misted dark with unspilled rain, that the dragon's blame that the sea was slate grey instead of blue-green, and the dragon's blame that the unblinking eye of the sun was dulled by a cataract of grey. When the dragon was slain, if he managed to slay it, this part of the world would brighten again, and Emery would be the light-bringer as well as king. He hated the dragon, it was that simple, and his hate was pure like the cleansing fire. He breathed in and out of his hatred as he sat upon his steed, as his eyes scanned the cliffs in front of him, searching for a way to climb them, though he knew exactly, already, that there would be no easy path. Who had built this castle into these cliffs? It was a mystery without an answer. Had they built it, or had it been born? Some wizened elders claimed that the castle emerged from the inner craggy cliffs over the millennia, growing a fraction of an inch a year, surfacing so slowly that its progress was imperceptible. Others countered that the castle had not emerged at all, but simply had always been like the sea, like the cliffs themselves, and to attempt to trace their origin was a fool's mission. No one knew how the castle had become to be, and Emery did not care. He did not care why a sun hung in the sky. It did, and that was enough for him. As long as it warmed the back each day and disappeared each night, Emery had no desire to waste his time examining the whys and wherefores behind its existence, and that was how he felt about the castle and the cliffs and the sea and the sky. The world was made, that was all. This resolved and set aside left Emery with just the question of how best to conquer it. "I'll have to scale it, Renard," Emery said. The horse grunted, warm clouds puffing out from his enormous nostrils. "You'll have to wait behind," Emery told him, to which Renard said nothing. That settled, Emery swung himself out of the saddle once again. Landing on the shifting pebbles of the beach, they crunched together under his feet like bones grinding. Renard would not need to be tied. He was a good horse, and he wouldn't go far, and if Emery did tie him, then he were to die. Either falling from the cliff or just in the jaws of the dragon he expected to encounter up above, Renard would die as well. Everything and everyone dies, of course, but dying while tied to the reins of an outcropping of rocks at the base of the cliff seemed like an undignified way to go, and Renard was not an undignified animal, and Emery was not, he thought, a cruel master. Once again Emery unhooked the long leather strap of the girth, pulling it from the brass ring of Renard's side, unwinding it as the horse relaxed his guts. He heaved the saddle down from Renard's proud high back, revealing a square patch of sweat-wet fur, which Emery had rubbed dry with the saddle blanket. Then he grabbed the crown piece of the bridle from behind Reynard's ears and pulled it forward, the bit clanking against the horse's teeth. Freed, Reynard stretched his neck long and wandered off, snuffling along the pebble beach in search of the few gray tufts of seagrass. Emery considered himself to be horselike in all the best ways. One thing he could do was place binders on his own vision, focusing on the singular task in front of him, and this he did now, preparing himself for the climb. The saddle and its bags were slung across a boulder, and Emery rifled to the stem with practiced purpose, gathering what he would need: rope, a pickaxe, a leather pouch of fine powdered chalk, leather gloves, a bladder of fresh water, his sword, which was never far from his body. In his pocket was his lucky talisman, a rabbit's foot he had cut himself from his first kill when he was 7 years old. Then he walked to the base of the cliffs, an almost vertical wall of slate, and placed his hands on its cold, hard surface. He looked up, craning his neck further and further back, and for a flash it seemed that the old legend had come true, and his field of vision filled so completely with grey, so much grey, so all-encompassing, that Emery was blinded by it, and he felt his bowels loosen with fear, and for a second he was a babe again, powerless and falling, with no knowledge of what was up and what was down, drowning in the grey that swirled around him, tumbling and helpless. But then he caught sight of his own hand against the grainless grey wall, and then he remembered himself. He was not powerless, he was not a babe. He was Emery of Harding, and he had a dragon to slay. Emery's hands. The slate was tricky. It was cold, as hard, as slick as ice. There were holds, but Emery found that he could not trust his vision to find them. The trick of greyness all around made this into the shadowless world, and the wall looked flat without dimension, but if he slid his fingers along its surface, he could feel the ridges, winkles, and recesses. That was where he would grab hold, and would make a ladder of them, an invisible chain of handholds and footholds. And so Emery began to climb. He had strapped his sword to his back to free his hips and legs, and belted the porch of chalk at his waist. He had tucked his black pants into his black boots, and his black shirt into his pants. He had used a strip of leather to gather his hair back into a rough knot, keeping it from his eyes. He had rolled his sleeves back in spite of the cold, knowing that he would be warm as he climbed. Hand over hand, hold over hold, Emery ascended. Always he had been a skilled climber, as well as a skilled fighter, a skilled rider, a skilled swimmer. Anything he needed his body to do, it did him well. Part of the trick was to take his mind off the task. In this, as in many things, his body knew better than his head what must happen next, and his mind's job was to keep still and let the muscles get on with it. As if watching a stranger, Emery saw his fingers creep along the wall, touch and reject his possible hold, find a second hold, accept it, and latch on claw-like. His feet shimmied up several inches, his biceps curled, and he was higher, 15 feet off the ground at least, and hundreds more to go. To keep his mind entertained while his body was working, Prince Emery of Harding allowed himself to imagine what they might be saying about him back at home. His mother, as ever, came first into his head. He saw her sitting where she liked best all the year round, regardless of the temperature, outside next to the fireplace in her chambers, pressed up closer to the flames than anyone else could stand, surrounded by cushions and cats and never dogs. "Now, Emery," she was wont to say, patting the cushions beside her, "tell me what you've conquered today." And as a young boy, Emery would obligingly scramble up beside her, and even with the key to the fire made him sweat, and report exactly what he had mastered. The puppy had trained to follow him through the palace grounds, simply by keeping a fatty piece of breakfast meat in his pocket. The teacher he had talked into freeing him from lessons a quarter of an hour early, the horse he had broken to saddle, the cook he had cajoled into baking an extra cake just for him. Later, when he was too big to cuddle, Emery would stand across from Mother and report just as proudly the buck he'd felled in Moss Forest, the soldiers he'd rallied to fight, the rider he'd beaten at joust, the scholar he'd bested at chess. Other conquests, those of soft-skinned variety, Emery did not tell Mother about, though he suspected that she both knew and approved of them. Pink-cheeked Elaine, the cowherd's daughter. Raven dark Lila, who kept shop for her mother, the apothecary. Flower-dusted kitchen of Princess Fabiana. On the heavy canvas sacks of flour in the cool dark pantry, while old Cookie pretended she didn't know what was going on, and Mother always listened and nodded and approved of things Emery said and things he did not say in equal measure. The fire blazed, the cats purred, and Mother listened. Emery's muscles warmed and loosened as he climbed. When his fingers began to slip with sweat on the slate, he dipped them into the bag of chalk, its fine powdery residue recalling flour that had puffed up from the sacks on which they lay from Fabiana herself as they rutted in the pantry back at home. But this was not a safe direction to allow his thoughts to wander. Not now, not here on this cliff 100 feet above the ground. From here a fall would be death. So Emery took Fabiana and placed her to the side, out of the way, where she belonged. He watched his left hand reach, fingertips stretched, feeling a hold that must be there. It must. He felt the strong muscles of his thighs and calves tremble as he pushed up onto the tips of his boots. As his right hand held to the good hold it had, the fingers of his left hand were still searching when the slate beneath his right hand began to crumble. At first the crumbling could be mistaken for just the sensation of the chalk powder rubbing against the wall. So fine was the beginning of the end. and brains do not want to believe they are imperiled. A brain will lie to the body even when the body is the brain's only hope. Emery had seen this many times, the blind state of disbelief from a buck, freezing in places it aimed the shot arrow, the blank-faced shock of impending loss on the face of the fighter, until that very moment had been defeated. So he did not trust his brain's initial reasoning. "It's just chalk powder," his brain told him. "It's fine." He wasn't fine. Not fine at all. And Emery shifted his weight even farther to the left, the fingers of that hand straining and praying for purchase, as the slate beneath his right hand crumbled in earth, the handhold disintegrating like burned stomach bone. For a fraction of a second Emery held nothing, not with his left hand, not with his right. No stone in his hands, no thought in his head, no hope in his heart, which did not dare even beat in that moment, no breath in his lungs, no sight in his eyes, suspended, still, empty, and then he began to fall. The Dragon's Lair. As cold as it was below it, so it was warm above. As grey as it was below, so it was golden above. On the outside the castle was cold and grey, it was true, but inside was a different story altogether. 1,000 feet above the cliff face from which Emery of Harding was falling, curled like a kitten, rested the dragon. If you were to visit the dragon in its chambers, the first thing you would notice, of course, was the dragon itself. The enormity of it, the vastness of its spear-shaped head, the rows of opalescent scales, each the size of a tea saucer. But what would you notice next? Well, if you were of a mercenary nature, perhaps it would be the jewels. Great piles of jewels filled each corner. Heaps of jewels spilled through each doorway. Hundreds of jewels lined the walls, a rainbow of opulence, rubies rich as blood, tourmalines as bright and round as oranges, citrons yellower than the sun, emeralds as green as the greed of goblins, sapphires as blue as the brightest sea, amethysts as purple as the velvet cloak of a king, and diamonds everywhere, diamonds. A veritable hoard of them. If, on the other hand, you had emerged half frozen from the cliffs below, perhaps the jewels would not be that drew your attention. Perhaps it would be the heat. Twin billows of steam emerged from the sleeping dragon's nostrils, thick plumes of dragon vapor. The dragon's lair was oppressive in its heat, sultry and overwhelming and boilingly hot. The air was almost hot enough and wet enough to poach an egg if you had an egg, almost hot enough to knock you flat. But if you were a visitor with a Narcissus-like vanity, perhaps the heat and the jewels, and maybe even the dragon itself, would not be what caught your eye first of all, for the entirety of the castle, floor to ceiling, each and every surface was lined in mirrors, mirrors that threw golden reflections tinted with rose, mirrors that reflected mirrors, and mirrors beyond that, and each of them, whichever way you turned, reflecting your reflection again and again forever, and woven through it all, the jewels and the heat in the rose-gold mirrors, was a scent, a balm, a spice, an infusion. It rose on the plumes of steam, it drifted through the open windows and diffused into the grayness outside, and it was this scent that Emery of Harding inhaled as his handhold turned to dust as he began to fall. He didn't have time to think about the scent and the words. If he kept falling, in a few seconds he would be dead. But somewhere in his brain the scent took hold. It matched like a key in a lock and opened up a memory. He was a child. No, an infant baby, newly born. No, before that even. He was a womb-bound. Yes, eyes opened. Breathing and swimming in the hot stew of his mother's juice, he could taste and smell it, the same sweet spice tang, then and again now, here from above. His left hand grabbed the pickaxe from his waist and struck it blindly at the slate-gray wall, and though it shouldn't have, though the chances were nearly naught, the pick found purchase. A slit in the rock just the width of the pickaxe's blade. Emery's fingers slid down the worn wood handle, and he was almost lost again, but he clenched his fist even tighter, and then he stopped, hanging and swinging by one arm, the joint of his shoulder nearly torn asunder. He breathed again, but the scent and the memory were gone. He brought his right hand up to meet his left, found holds for one foot, and then the other, closed his eyes and bent his head for just a moment in thanks and prayer to the gods, but also to his own strength and quickness, and then he grasped the wall again with his right hand, pulled the pickaxe free with his left, and resumed his climb. At the top of the cliff, in the warm room, surrounded by mirrors and jewels and clouds of its own exhaled heat, the dragon opened one amber eye. Paulin's hawk. His strong right hand was the first part of Emery to make it hours later to the top of the cliff, trembling, his right arm bent, hoisting the rest of Emery, his sweat-darkened head, strands of hair escaping from the leather tie, his straining reddened face, his wide shoulders, his chest, his narrow waist, the crooks of him, and then his legs and feet. It was like being born new, emerging from over the edge of the cliff, and like a newborn, Emery wanted to rest and wail and suck up air. He lay on the gray slate ground and felt every muscle burning, every joint on fire, his lungs working in shallow pants, greedy for air but too weak to take in all they needed. He wanted to retch, he wanted to faint. But instead he stood. He stood as tall and wide as he could, and he turned his face in the direction of the castle and smiled, flashing his teeth. For like all good hunters, Emery knew when he was being hunted, and he felt the dragon's amber eye upon him as surely as the sun. Then, knowing the dragon was watching him, unbuttoned the front of his trousers, freed his yard, pissed a streaming stream right there at the top of the cliff, marking it as his own. That accomplished, he retucked, rebuttoned. Emery approached the castle. At home, all of Harding would be resting after their noontime meal. The ladies would be in their chambers, loosening their stays to aid digestion. The older women gathering in circles around their handiwork, the girls piling together on the tall curtained beds to laugh and gossip. The men and the boys would be out of doors if the day was fine, sporting with their horses or the hounds, or perhaps playing at swords with the younger boys. Of course, servants would be neither resting nor playing, but rather working, as was their duty, clearing away the noon meal, beginning the preparations for supper, carrying water for the well, beating rugs free of dust, shoveling manure from the pig's sty, and all the other labors that Emery was only aware of when someone had failed to do them. If he were home right now, Emery would perhaps be walking the fence line with Paulin, the falconer, who would himself be accompanied by Isolda, his hawk, who would perch, as she always did, on Paulin's leather gauntlet, her leather jesses streaming like ribbons from her legs. Isolda would listen as Paulin bragged about everything, the hunt of the day before, the conquest of the night before, the hardiness of Paulin's erection. Like the blacksmith's hammer it was, and Emery would listen too and laugh, for Paulin was as clever as he was loyal, and an afternoon spent in his company was sure to be entertaining. But Emery was not home. He was not flanked by friendship and laughter. There was no ease here on the cliffs before this great grey castle. There was no good meal as in his belly, or wine in his cup. There was no cup. Emery took his water bladder from his side and sucked like a babe at the teat until it was empty. If he were to die in that castle, there would be no need for more water. For in spite of his bravado, a great hot jet of urine, and the strong square of his shoulders, Emery was afraid. And why wouldn't you be? Emery heard Paulin's voice echo in his head. You'd be darned idiot not to be scared, for God's balls. There's a dragon up there. Imagining Paulin beside him helped Emery relax a bit, for Paulin would have found a way to make even a situation as grim as the one into which Emery had placed himself seem a lark. Yes, Paulin was there just to his right, and Isolda as well, with her ever-disdainful expression, eager to be loosened from Paulin's arm, and ready to gore out an amber eye with her ferocious beak if need be. He was not alone. I am not alone, Emery told himself. He had arrived alone at the great door of the dragon's castle. At its base, looking up, Emery felt almost as overwhelmed as he had at the base of the cliff. Such a door, broad as 2 men laid, head to toe, as tall as 10, grey but not cold. Even before he touched it, Emery felt the heat that radiated off the door, generated no doubt by the dragon within. He laid his hand flat against the door and immediately withdrew it. Hot, hot, too hot. He pulled his gloves from the waistband of his pants and drew them on, fine black leather gloves, sewn just for him by his mother. She had given the gloves to him from the chair by her fire when he had gone to kiss her good-bye. My fine young man, she had said, let us speak honestly with one another. You are no longer a boy, but you are just barely a man. You are a skilled fighter. That is the truth, but dragons are bigger and tougher than even the best of men. It had hurt to hear his mother speak so, but it had felt good too, like when a boil is lanced, pain mixed with relief. I know my chances, Emery had said, but what is my choice? For Emery's father was dead 2 fortnights now from a spearing madness, some had said started with his early affection for horse, before he had married Emery's mother, which had gone dormant for many years, re-emerging just last winter when his muscles began to seize, his face began to sag, his eyes began to cloud, and he began to shout loudly, whether anyone listened or not, that the dragon was coming, that it would feast on Emery's heart, that the dragon was coming, until at last his screaming stopped and he was dead. The king should have lived another 10 years, maybe another 20. And with that time Emery would have trained. He would have prepared the best he could. With Paulin at his side and all the aid and assistance of Harding's best fighters, Emery would have grown stronger and faster and surer of foot and deadlier. The truth was that the king's early death had stolen years of preparation from Emery. It mattered not to the people of Harding that Emery must face a dragon before he had even reached his 20th year, though his forebears, as far back as history remembered, had made it nearly to 30 before each faced his dragon. For Emery to take his father's place as king, he must do as his father had done, and his father before him. He must conquer a dragon and rescue a damsel, and take that maiden as his bride. And he must do so without having been given any instruction in the ways of dragons, and he must do it single-handedly, without aid from any quarter. For so it had been throughout his people's memory, that a dragon and a damsel made a king. Your chances may be slim, the queen mother said, who had herself once been a rescued maiden. But your choices, as you say, are slimmer, so take these gloves." She handed them into Emery's grasp, and he took them. They were heavier than they looked to be, and the leather, though soft, was thick. "These will protect your hands against the dragon's heat," she said. "They are half of what I have to offer, and they are not enough," she went on, "so listen to what else I have to say. Your sword is one weapon. Your mind is another. But you have a third, and to conquer the dragon you shall need all three." Emery looked deep into his mother's dark eyes, waiting for her to tell him what his third weapon was, but something in him told him not to ask. He had nodded as if he had understood, and thanked her for the gloves, and kissed her cheek, and walked away, leaving her in a chamber by the fire, a ginger cat curled in her lap. The gloves were on his hands. His sword was at his hip. His brain was in his head. Whether or not Emery had the other weapon, the one his mother had told him he would need, well, it no longer mattered, did it, for Emery watched his hand push against the door, and he heard it moan open, and he stepped inside the dragon's castle. The Devil's Eye. Emery was a warrior first, so the dragon was the first thing he saw. Nothing else mattered except for how it would figure in battle. The debilitating heat mattered only in the challenge it would pose to Emery's stamina. The heaping jewels mattered only in how the piles of them might provide protection, how they might be useful as weapons. The mirrors he noted as a strike in the dragon's favor, for surely the dragon was used to their deception, though Emery was not. The scent, the sweet spice tang that he could not see but was as real as everything else in the great castle hall. The scent he took care not to breathe in too deeply, for perhaps it was poisonous. Sword unsheathed, held steady in front of him, Emery assessed his enemy. Why a creature this repugnant would choose to line its lair in reflective glass, Emery could not begin to guess. For though its opalescent scales were what drew a man's gaze, the skin around the dragon's eye slits and nostrils was pure like dried blood. The claws on the dragon's front feet, which had crossed in front of itself like a house cat, were each a black, serrated, menacing hook that could tease the guts from a man with the gentlest stroke. From where he stood, Emery could see but one of the dragon's eyes, and it was closed. Great bursts of steam billowed from the dragon's nostrils. The mirrored walls dripped with condensation. The beast had holes instead of ears. The tips of black teeth gleamed along the edges of its lipless reptilian mouth. A tongue flicked out, forked, black, awful, and disappeared. And then Emery looked past the beast's head, into the mirror behind it. Slitted, unblinking amber, the reflection of the dragon's other eye, open, watching. Emery gasped, his breath catching like a death rattle, for in that moment he knew that he would die. He knew it as sure as he had been about everything ever before, and he wished suddenly with a fervor that he was just a boy again. In the dragon's amber gaze, Emery saw the sun of his 7th summer. For the hottest 3 days of that summer in mid-August, some strange celestial event had cast a shadow across the middle of the sun, a long slit. It looked like that transformed the sun Emery had always known into a cruel reptilian eye. Devil's Eye, the priests called it, kissing the sharp-tipped triangles they wore on chains about their necks, and they warned everyone to stay inside, away from the unblinking watch. But Emery's father, the king, did not abide such hogswallop. "Come, son," he said on the hottest of the 3 days, the last, "we shall hunt." And he waved away the squires and the footmen and the master of the hounds, taking only a paring knife in the kitchen, 2 apples, and Emery's own small bow and quiver of arrows. Young Emery followed his father away from the castle and keep, and the weight of the Devil's Eye heavy on his head, and he followed his father through the gate in the wall and on until they reached the forest. Dappled and shadowed and hushed where the eye could not see him any more, the king was a big man, broad and handsome, and skin tanned to leather, feet and hands calloused from battle and from play. At 7, Emery already fashioned his hair after his father's, worn down in loose black curls to please the ladies when at court, and tied back with a strip of leather when afield. The king's strong brow meant he never had to squint against the sun, and his full mouth was never afraid to laugh, to kiss, to eat, to cry. He was a man who held life in his jaws as a dog held a smoked lamb's leg, with devourous greed and absolute pleasure. On this day he would teach his son, his first and only child, how to kill. What a pleasant way to spend a summer afternoon. Emery carried his own quiver across his shoulder, his own bow in his hand. He had unloaded his small shafts many times into targets and practiced dummies, to the applause and praise of his teachers, and with his quiver on his shoulder, and his father at his side, and now he was hidden by trees from the Devil's Eye. He felt himself very brave indeed. He imagined that he and his father were two of a pair, both big, both strong, both rulers of their world. He followed his father and made a game of stepping just where his father stepped before him, hopping from place to place. Since the king's stride was easily 3 times the length of his own, it was cooler in the forest, away from the sun's reach, and Emery was happy. Suddenly his father stopped. Emery stopped too, just barely before crashing into the king's back. "There," said the king, and he pointed not 20 feet away, near the base of the tall fir tree, at a light brown hare. Emery did not hesitate. He reached over his left shoulder with his right hand, plucked an arrow from the quiver, notched it in his bow, and with an exhale loosed it. The hare looked up and locked its gaze with Emery's. Its eyes, jewel black and shiny, did not blink. The hare knew it was too late, no hope for mercy, and Emery knew it was too late to call back his arrow, though if he could have, he would not. The arrow struck the hare in its neck, piercing through the front and climbing out the other side, blood-stained in its white scuff red. It was dead before Emery had to run its body. He stared down at the rabbit. Its eyes had just been alive with shine a second before, and now were dull with death. The king's heavy calloused hand landed with a thump on Emery's shoulder. "Well done, my son," he said, and then he handed Emery the paring knife and said, "Choose the best foot." Emery selected the right rear, because he himself favored his right hand, because the rear foot was where a hare held its power. His father, the king, watched as Emery sawed through the still warm fur, meat, tendon, and bone to retrieve his talisman. Then the king took the paring knife. Emery watched him slit an opening in the rabbit's fur and set aside the knife. The king glided his pointer and middle fingers of both hands into the hole he made, and he pulled, and with a sound like cloth tearing, the rabbit's pelt pulled away, revealing the white shiny membrane underneath, and beneath that, the red muscles and white tendons and bones. The king tore all the pelt all the way open to the head and remaining hind foot, and then he snapped the foot as easy as could be, sawed through the neck, and pulled the pelt the rest of the way free. He flipped the rabbit belly side up, made a shallow cut just through the thin white skin, slipped his fingers underneath to lift the skin away from the intestines, and cut all the way up the length of the rabbit. Pulling open the skin, he carefully retrieved the heart, placing it into Emery's cupped hands. "It's your heart, son," he said. "Do you want to eat it now or later, after Cookie can fry it up?" Emery stared down at the raw red thing he was holding. He knew his father wanted him to eat it now, raw and fresh from the rabbit's chest, but he thought of swallowing such a warm, slimy thing like a large red slug made him feel as if he might vomit. "Later, please," he said, and if the king was displeased, he would not show it. He turned back to his work, quickly spilling the intestines into the dirt and scooping the liver, kidneys, lungs, and the heart from Emery's hands into a leather pouch. What was left of Emery's kill looked like meat now, rather than rabbit, and Emery's mouth began to water. How pleased Mother would be! Then the king had given Emery an apple to eat on the walk home, and let Emery lead the way. Now here in the dragon's lair, seeing the reflected amber eye watching him, Emery remembered he had been afraid of the devil's eye when he had entered the forest, and though it had still hung in the sky when he emerged, with the hare's foot in his pocket and his first kill behind him. It was no longer the devil's eye that hung in the sky, not to Emery. It was only a trick of the shadow and light, and nothing more. "Dragon," he said, "the talisman from a decade ago snug in his pocket. I am here to conquer you." Perhaps he would die today. Perhaps he would live. Either way, he would not hesitate. He would not falter. A dragon is big and a scary thing, but it is not only big and scary thing. Emery had seen others. Perhaps this monstrosity before him was like the devil's eye from his childhood, made bigger and scarier by fear and ignorance, cut down and put into its place with perspective and knowledge. The dragon opened its other eye and turned its giant head, and then it opened its jaws, black teeth, black forked tongue. It roared a deafening screech that vibrated Emery's skeleton. Or Emery reconsidered, perhaps not. Emery's sword. Emery held his weapon waist high, perpendicular to the ground, cutting his field of vision into two equal parts. He shifted his weight from right to left and back again, testing the beast's response to his movement. Its gaze, he noted, did follow him, but slowly, as if it didn't see him well or clearly. In his kingdom, no one would speak to Emery about dragons all his life. He had known that one day he would face the dragon, unaided and untaught, but still he heard things from time to time, servants telling tales, stories bandied about at market. Although he had no real study of dragons on which to depend, he'd heard it said that dragons had vision only for far and not for close, and other times that the dragon's deep love of gold and jewels comes from their attraction for brightly colored things. This had all seemed like the senseless talk of those who had never themselves met a dragon in close quarters and had nothing better to do with their idle time and their chatter, but seeing this creature's unfocused gaze gave Emery hope that perhaps there was some truth to the old legends after all. Then his steel blade caught a glint of sunlight through the window, and the dragon's focus shifted in an instant, becoming razor sharp, and it drew itself upon its haunches, claws tapping the mirrored floor, and stepped toward him. It was the brightness that drew the dragon's gaze. Emery shifted his sword so the sun no longer struck it, and he stepped back as the dragon opened its maw. He had half a second before a jet of blue flame sprayed out, and he leaped away, rolling behind a mountain of jewels just in time. He had to dull the shine of his blade. Emery looked about, desperate, but all around him were jewels' reflection of jewels, and reflections of his own panicked visage, the color high in his cheeks. But there, at his reflection's waist, the bag of chalk he'd used when climbing, Emery dug a handful of powder from the bag, its dry coolness cutting his fingers. Such a contrast to the hall's humid feet, and he rubbed it across the blade, turning his sword from hilt to tip a dull gray white. The hand he'd dipped into the chalk had been transformed as well, its bronze skin well masked, so Emery dug into the bag again, scooping up another fistful of chalk, and he rubbed it into his cheeks, his forehead, his chin, his nose, his neck, turning himself into a ghost, a shadow warrior. As a test, he found a gem, a ruby the size of an apple, and rolled it away from the pile as quietly as he could. The dragon's smart amber gaze was upon it at once, tracking its progress across the floor. Then his heart pounding in his throat, Emery extended his arm from behind the jewel heap where he crouched, waiting for the dragon's breath to scorch it. Nothing. Emery wriggled his fingers. Again nothing. Drawing his hand back, Emery sighed his relief. There was naught wrong with the dragon's hearing. Emery instantly learned as the beast charged the jewel sack with a roar, sending gems flying to chatter in all directions, striking the mirrored walls in a series of bangs and crashes. Silent as a ghost, Emery slipped along the wall to the far side of the chamber, and the dragon did not follow. The mirrors all around were not made of glass. They were instead highly polished sheets of gold that reflected almost as clearly as a looking-glass, but with a strange rosy tint that he could not explain. There were panels in the mirrors, Emery saw, panels that meant there were rooms beyond this one, rooms in which a damsel must be hidden. Was she suffering, he wondered, his faded beauty? Was she locked, unchained? Was she frightened? Was she somewhere? Emery knew, and he would find her, but first he must focus here in this room on this foe. He trained his mind back onto his immediate surroundings. Now that he had proved true the chatter he'd heard about a dragon's vision, Emery racked his brain for anything else he might have heard about the beast. Not many places you can stick a dragon, Tad, the pig boy, had told his fellow stop-hands. It was early evening, just before the sunset, and Emery and Mattie, the hedge warder's niece, were trying their best to stay silent in the hayloft where he had just relieved her of her virginity. "Oh, Tad, you don't know shite about dragons," said the little Merle, hefting his bucket of scraps up into the trough. "Do, too," Tad shouted. "I know a sight more than you fools, I spect." "Spect all you want," said Merle's older brother Darrell. "You don't know shite about shite." "I know shite about your sister's titties," Tad yelled, and then Darrell swung his slop pail at Tad's head, and Merle jumped into the fight, and the three shop boys were in the mud alongside the pigs. Emery and Mattie did their best to stifle each other's laughter. Emery's hand across Mattie's mouth, her face buried in Mattie's naked breast. When the three boys finally broke apart and headed toward their hut, Mattie said, "Everybody knows the only place to pierce a dragon is in the soft skin under its arm." As soon as the words were out, she gasped and clasped her hands over her mouth in a pretty gesture, and then Emery had set into showing Mattie how much fun she could have, relieved as she was of the responsibility of virginity, and he had forgotten all about dragons. But now in the dragon's lair, emboldened by his success with the chalk, Emery eyed the dragon's form, and he wondered if Mattie had perhaps been right. The dragon's armpit. Had Emery not been intent on killing, he may not have been able to see what a spectacular achievement of artistic beauty the commencing battle was to take place in. But warrior that he was, he saw the great hall only for what he needed from it, places to hide, a network of assets and liabilities, stacks of jewels, double asset, reflective surfaces, liabilities. Such a perspective left no room for wonder. Perhaps this was not the time for wonder, or perhaps it is always time for wonder, no time more so than when one's very life is facing the very real possibility of immediate termination. In any case, had Emery been someone else, he would have seen that his reluctant host was an artist of incomparable talent. The talent was an art of arrangement. The gem towers were not random, not mercenary stacks, thrown together without regard for aesthetics. They were carefully constructed dances of color, shape, and light, and each of them told a story, called forth an emotion. Here in the citrons and diamonds, a monument to spring and hope and youth. There, in rubies in all shades and shapes, an angry roar and blood spilled in battle. Under a wide window, a twisting river in emeralds and sapphires dotted with diamonds to make the water glint. The great hall was a sanctuary, the gems its altar. To Emery it was but a battleground. He plucked from the river a fist-sized emerald cylinder and threw it at the pyramid of rubies. It crashed down, decimating the carefully constructed arrangement of crimson gems, and the dragon turned in that direction, a roar tearing from its throat. Emery heard the anger in the dragon's roar, but his ears, like the dragon's eyes, did not perceive the whole truth, for he did not hear the dragon's anguish, he did not hear its grief, he could not understand why the dragon might drop its head, might close its eyes. All he saw was an enemy and an opportunity. The dragon's flank turned toward him, its attention to the ruined. Emery scanned its body, looking for a place where its scales might not protect it. Emery thought that while Maddie had been wrong about waiting to keep her virginity, she had been quite right about the vulnerability of a dragon's armpit, for there, with its great front legs stretched forward, was a thin slit of scaleless dragon skin, dull dark red, a perfect target for his sword. He would have one shot, that was all. If his sword missed its mark, the dragon would kill him. Now was not the time for brain. That had been earlier, when he disguised the sword's shine in the color of his own flesh. Now was the time for steel. He raced forward, leaped sword arm back, landed just behind the dragon's left front leg, and thrust true, his sword sinking deep inside the dragon's exposed red flesh. A truer mark had never been hit. The dragon roared, and this time Emery heard it rightly, more anger mixed with pain. It whipped around, and Emery, who hung tight to his sword's handle, swung like a puppet from its side. Then his sword shifted in the meat of the beast, digging deeper, yes, but also listing to the side, and its hilt rubbed against the sharp armor of the dragon's scales. A terrible screech rang out for the clash of steel against scale. But the dragon is mightier than the sword, and the scale's razor edge snapped his shaft. He fell for the dragon's side, sword pommel still in hand, the blade still inside the creature's body. He landed with an oof, which he immediately regretted as the sound of it alerted the dragon of his position. But it was currently engaged with the remainder of his sword in his side, attempting to bite it out. The steel was in a tricky spot just out of easy reach, so Emery had a moment to regroup. He rolled himself behind what he had failed to recognize as a self-portrait of the dragon, rendered in diamonds and opals. There he lay, staring up at himself, reflected down from the rose-gold ceiling. The dragon writhed in worry, thrashing upon the floor of the chamber. Its mighty tail smashed one of the last remaining sculptures, and jewels scattered in confusion and color and sound. As the beast snapped at the protruding bit of blade, Emery clenched his fist. He had used his brain, he had used his steel. His mother and queen had said, "Your sword is one weapon, your mind is another, but you have a third, and to conquer the dragon you shall need all three." And suddenly, certainly, Emery knew what his third weapon was, and what he must do.